From Gallatin County to Scott County, we're your home for country favorites. 95.3 WIKI, Carrollton, Madison.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily the views of Wagon Wheel Broadcasting, WIKI Radio, its management, employees, or advertisers. This program paid for by the Jefferson County Sons and Daughters of Liberty.
Greetings, Madison, the Ohio River Valley, the United States of America, as we're online. This is Rick and Rick at Night. We are the voice of liberty here in the Ohio River Valley. We're sponsored by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty here in Jefferson County, but we're also supported by the efforts of Tea Parties everywhere. I'm Rick Roos. My partner Rick Berry and I are delighted to be here once again.
Hello, everybody.
We'd like to shout out to and express our true thanks to our friend Doc and DuPont and so many others who have served our country so valiantly and who are continuing to serve valiantly. And I also shout out to my niece, Elise, over in Afghanistan, who I think's listening to us online. This is a conversation we hope you'll join. And our local number is 812-574-0953 and toll-free 877-953-0953. We're on the web. Unfortunately, Tom, the Outlook Express doesn't like it when we try to put the link into WIKI for some reason. But we hope people are computer savvy enough to Google it, and we welcome your calls. We'd ask you that you give your first name and where you're calling from. We're honored. We welcome once again to our show and now our studio a great friend to Rick and Rick at Night, Indiana State Senator, or Indiana State Treasurer.
Congratulations.
And United Senate candidate Richard Mourdock.
Well, thanks, Rick. Great to be back with you. Great to be in studio with you here for a change.
And no severe thunderstorms or anything like that like last May.
That's right. We were joking before. I think in the last 4 or 5 times I've been to Madison, it's always been raining. So one of these days we'll be here when the sun is shining, or at least the stars can be seen.
Well, and it only started raining about an hour ago.
And I think it was when Richard was on. I think it was when we had the severe thunderstorm, and I think half the town got knocked out. So they didn't get. A lot of people didn't get to hear you. So we're going to make up for it tonight. And we're so glad to have you.
Well, great to be here.
And I think we finally figured out how to get it on YouTube. And then one of these days we'll figure out how to get it on podcasts. But you're running for United States Senate.
Indeed.
Why?
Well, that's a very easy question, and it is simply because I love this country, and like so many Americans, I'm fearful for our future. You know, we have Washington, D.C. right now in so many ways is out of touch with what's happening here and what they probably see as flyover country. We have some basic values here that frankly aren't being shared any longer in Washington, and we need some more conservative voices. Long story, but I'll make this very short. Even as I was being asked last year to consider doing this, I had that doubt in my own mind. Would one more voice in the United States Senate really mean that much? And at one point I had a conversation with a leading conservative senator and said something like that, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Richard, it isn't just quantity we need, it's quality." He said, "Give me another 4 or 5 conservatives in this place and we will change the leadership," which doesn't necessarily mean change personnel, but at least change the way of thinking, and we certainly need that. And that was the moment when I decided I'm in this race.
I remember asking you when we had our Tea Party a year ago, and there wasn't even a mention of it, and but the message that you gave, and I also tell our listeners, you plug in Richard Mourdock to the Sons and Daughters Liberty Tea Party, you'll see that the 2 speeches he gave for us, as well as hit the Lincoln Reagan Day speech, and I mean he's all over the YouTube, but I mean this was down here. I said, and I'll say it in his presence as well, this man's positively Lincoln-esque. He also, not only understands Lincoln, but he can tell a story.
Well, I do confess I am a Lincolnophile, as we're known, those of us who love Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know how many books I've read of Lincoln over the years, but the more I read of him, the more I study of Lincoln, the more and more relevant he becomes. You know, just today I happened to hear a discussion on Rush Limbaugh's show where he was quoting Paul Ryan Paul Ryan was then being quoted by Jeb Bush, and supposedly Ryan was saying how we need to have this this part of our culture where anyone has the right to rise. And I kept waiting for either Mr. Ryan or Jeb Bush or Rush Limbaugh to give full credit to that. That is from Abraham Lincoln. It was Abraham Lincoln's phrase that every American had that right to rise. And we should have it again, and I certainly agree with the concept. And yet again, Mr. Lincoln leads the way for the 21st century.
That's actually one of the questions I was going to ask you. Do you listen to Rush?
When I can. Occasionally I'm traveling. I always enjoy listening to Rush. Don't always agree with him, but he always has a thoughtful and obviously an entertaining way in presenting conservative points of view. And without question, he has changed the landscape of America for conservatism like no one else since Ronald Reagan left the White House.
I think he validates what a lot of us believe and have believed, but we didn't put it into words. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Newt said that, and I think that's Lincoln-esque as well. And you got me convinced to read Doris Kearns Goodwin as far as a Team of Rivals, and I'm just sitting there going, I had her as kind of a plagiarizing, which was unfortunate. It was an excellent book.
It is an outstanding book. And you mentioned Newt Gingrich. It's amusing to me that as Newt's been talking about, should he be the nominee of the Republican Party, he wants to have 7 Lincoln-Douglas-style debates against Barack Obama, which I think if you put that on pay-per-view, it would be a wonderful thing. They would make a lot of money off pay-per-view putting a Newt Gingrich, Barack Obama speech on the air. But, even in the format in which Abraham Lincoln started chasing Stephen Douglas around the countryside in 1858, he wanted to have 155 debates with Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas, of course, ignored him. So for 3 weeks, wherever Stephen Douglas went, Abraham Lincoln showed up the next day and gave a speech rebutting everything Douglas had said the day before. And as a result, Lincoln got more publicity than what Douglas was getting, so all of a sudden Douglas realized he had to change things, and that's when he came back to say, well, let's have 7 debates, and hence that's what Gingrich is calling for today, is to say 7 debates. So again, we see Mr. Lincoln in the 21st century.
And that does put the current president in quite a quandary. I mean, he's darned if he does, and he's darned if he doesn't, so he's going to have to do something.
That's exactly right. And I don't know that he's said this publicly before, but I'm going to sound like a giant name dropper here, but a week and a half ago I had dinner with Newt Gingrich, and he made the comment that once he puts all those demands out after the convention to go after Obama, of course, will say no, he's not going to do it. And Newt said, at that point, my schedule will be set by the White House. No matter where he goes, the next day I will show up and give a speech to rebut everything. So that would be great fun to watch. We'll see what happens over the next few months.
Richard, one thing I wanted to say is you have embraced the Tea Party. I don't know what came first. Did the Tea Party embrace you, or did you embrace the Tea Party? And I know that's one question I haven't asked you.
Sure. Well, my wife likes to say I was Tea Party before there was a Tea Party. But in many ways, I think the Tea Party kind of embraced me back in the summer of 2009 after the Chrysler bankruptcy case took place, where several pension funds, one of which I serve as a trustee for here in Indiana, lost its secured creditors' rights when the Obama administration threw away 200 years of bankruptcy law. We weren't going to stand for that. We took the case ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court, and when I did that, it was just when the Tea Party movement was beginning, and started hearing from people all over the state, literally all over the country, in fact, saying, thank heaven somebody's standing up for the Constitution. So there was a natural affinity there.
Well, that's how it happened with you here in Madison. It was just kind of a natural connection. I know one thing you do, there's a lot of guys out there, I think they agree with what the Tea Party stands for, but they're kind of afraid to say. You start off all your speeches here recently, last year or so, you start off with your speech because you say, and to all you Tea Party people out there, I have 3 words.
God bless you.
God bless you.
Absolutely.
And it just makes me feel great.
Well, I think a lot of people in the media today don't understand yet what the Tea Party is about. It isn't about, certainly as they would like to have Tea Party people portrayed, about a mean-spirited, racist group of people. It is about a group of people, many independents, many times Republicans, some Democrats, to be sure. Certainly I know black Americans, black Hoosiers who are heavily involved with the Tea Party. These are people simply who want to see their country country set back on a simpler set of values, a more sound cultural society, and, dare I even think it, a government that lives within its means. Most people that when I talk to them in the Tea Party and start to ask a little in-depth question as to why are you here, it's about what they fear for this country's future when they understand that we cannot spend our way to prosperity, and yet they see the Washington politicians trying to do that, and that's what they're afraid of.
You know, Richard, when we had the Tea Party congressman holding out on the vote, I had a good friend of mine that called them extremists. And I looked at him and I said, so the people that want to balance the budget are the extremists. And he kind of nodded, shook his head, didn't have much of a comment back to me. But that's kind of where we're at. Wrong is right, and truth is lie, and lie is truth. And I think we were warned years ago by somebody, and Rick probably knows, that's what would happen when our country faced this kind of crisis.
Well, that's exactly right. And, you know, when the credit downgrade took place last August, after the federal government failed to cut $4 trillion out of our 10-year spending plan, that credit downgrade took place, and you had Chuck Schumer and Barney Frank and a few of the uber liberals out there saying, oh, it's a Tea Party downgrade. It's a Tea Party downgrade. You're exactly right. All the Tea Party was saying is let's live within our means. You know, I like to tell people that wasn't a Tea Party downgrade, but I do believe there is a Tea Party downgrade coming. It's going to be in November of 2012 when Barack Obama gets the downgrade back to community organizer.
We can only hope.
We can only hope, and I think it will happen.
This is Rick and Rick at Night, the voice of liberty here in the Ohio River Valley, and we're talking to Richard Mourdock, state treasurer, and soon to be United States Senator from the great state of Indiana. You're running against Richard Lugar. I know that you were quoted, was by Wes Prudent last summer in the Washington Times, and you really have honored Senator Lugar.
I do. I have great respect for Senator Lugar. Anyone who serves 50 years in public service, as Mr. Lugar has, deserves the respect of each and every one of us. I would be a hypocrite of the highest order if I went out and attacked Dick Lugar on every basis, on everything he stands for. I'd be a hypocrite because the truth is I've voted for Dick Lugar many times. But as I look at his recent votes, and especially in the last couple of years when he's earned that nickname as Barack Obama's favorite Republican, when I look at the votes that he cast that earned him that nickname, I have to come to the conclusion, as I think most conservatives would in this state, he's not the same Dick Lugar. You know, if this were 1980, we might understand why he would be the co-sponsor of something like the DREAM Act, because in 1980 there wasn't a huge flood of illegal immigrants in this country, and it might have seemed somewhat compassionate. But now we're looking at anywhere from 10 to 14 million illegals here, and I think most people believe if you reward illegal behavior, you're only going to get more of it. When Dick Lugar during the lame duck session took the lead on trying to get the START treaty, and ultimately did get the START treaty through the U.S. Senate, you know, if it was the Cold War era, maybe that might have made some sense. But where we are today, I don't see it. And even with his vote against earmark reform, if this were the 1970s, 1980s, maybe even into the 1990s when we had a balanced budget, it might be easy to look the other way. But at a time where we now have a historic $15 trillion national debt, and you won't do away with earmarks, it's a different time.
We cut an ad, not on your behalf. This was not sanctioned by the Mourdock for Senate campaign, but this was just something we did. Tom, can you roll that? Mm-hmm. This is a missing senator alert. Senator Richard Lugar has not been in Madison since 2002. That's over 100 months, folks. Yet he wants to return to Washington, D.C. Things have gotten so bad that even when Lugar comes back to Indiana, he stays in a hotel. Lugar used to be Nixon's favorite mayor. Now he is Barack Obama's favorite Republican. Photos of Lugar appeared in campaign ads that helped Obama win Indiana. Lugar voted for the three most liberal justices on the Supreme Court. He has voted to increase the gasoline tax, increase Social Security taxes. He voted for a Democrat cap-and-trade scheme, voted against cutting the federal budget, and will not sign the Taxpayer Protection Pledge. Gun Owners of America give Lugar a lifetime rating of F. The NRA gives him a D+. Lugar has been in D.C. too long. We need to defeat Obama and his regime in 2012. We also need to help Richard Lugar retire. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty approve this message. We paid for it. I know you didn't sanction it. You didn't ask for it. We just did it.
I saw him shaking his head, though. I think he might have liked it.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I had not heard that. So certainly I didn't hear anything in there factually that there can be any argument about. So appreciate you helping to get the word out on so many issues. There was a lot.
It's on
there.
YouTube.
Well, there's a lot there, certainly.
But the quote that Wes Pruden, I love reading Wes Pruden. I have for the last 20 years, even before I understood I was a conservative. Okay, but he quoted you, and as far as announced the primary challenge, careful about not sounding rude or impolite. He wants to save Mr. Lugar from an embarrassing exit, and he quotes you. I don't think any Hoosier, and this includes myself, wants to see the last image of Senator Lugar's career being a concession speech. We really do have great respect for him, but I hear it 500 times a day. People come up to me and say, "Thank you for running," and 2 words:
It's time.
It's time.
Absolutely. It's took place today. I was on the phone much of the day, and I hear people who have said, I've always given a check to Mr. Lugar. I've always voted for Mr. Lugar. I just wish he wouldn't be doing this. And they then end it with those 2 words: it's time.
As far as where you split with the senator, and I also go with Mr. Newt's idea as far as the activist judges. This has got to stop. I mean, the last 3 that have been appointed to the Supreme Court have just been abysmal. And then you look at district court decisions, and I don't know if Newt's too radical as far as what he's saying to do about it, but what are you thinking about what you've been hearing?
Well, certainly some of the things Speaker Gingrich has talked about would require a change of the Constitution, which would basically put federal judges either up for some sort of term limit or at least perhaps some type of referendum. I don't know that we'll go that direction. I think that would take a lot more anger in the public mood towards judges than what we have right now. But what we do have right now, what we should be seeing right now, is a constitutionally established exercise of the check and balance. I certainly disagree with Senator Lugar's position. I would not have voted for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I would not have voted for Sonia Sotomayor, and I certainly wouldn't have voted for Elena Kagan. In fact, Elena Kagan, as you probably know, was Solicitor General of the United States. It's come out recently that she was out there pushing to get Obamacare through, being a cheerleader for it. So I've already stepped out to call for her to recuse herself when that case gets to the United States Supreme Court, as it will. I wish Mr. Lugar would join me in that, because there have been a handful of U.S. senators who've taken that step already, and clearly her position is well known. She can't be expected to be a neutral party if she has to make a ruling. Every now and then I hear, and I've heard Senator Lugar say it in the past, that his vote on those federal judgeships is basically giving discretion to the electoral process, which is to say that famous expression, elections should have consequences. And he believes, as some others do, that if a president is elected, they get to appoint whoever they want, and short of gross malfeasance, the Senate should just wink, nod, and go along with it. I disagree. The U.S. Constitution doesn't say rubber stamp. It says advice and consent. And I think advice and consent means looking at the broad judicial background, the judicial temperament that a candidate would bring, a nominee would bring, and you act accordingly.
But you wonder, does he see what they did to Samuel Alito? I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, I can remember Samuel Alito's wife in tears behind him as the questioning continued, and Samuel Alito, for by all rights, is a fine, upstanding man. So if he sees it coming from the other side, I wonder why he thinks it's not good for the conservative side.
I think it goes back to those 2 words. It's time. When Senator Dick Lugar was elected to the United States Senate in 1976, there was a sense of collegiality there. There was a sense of not so much go along to get along, but at least it was a gentlemanly atmosphere. The Robert Bork nomination, however, changed all that. It's become a verb, to be borked. Absolutely. Because the Teddy Kennedy and the others took after him and just were relentless in attacking him. And for whatever reason, and Mr. Lugar is not alone among Republicans in this way who've looked at judges as they've come since, but it's like they forget all of that. And they forget that harsh level of partisanship that was expressed by the Democrats toward the Republican nominees. Look back at what Clarence Thomas went through. It's amazing that that man, who is a stalwart conservative, it's amazing that that man survived and was ultimately placed on the Supreme Court, where, by all accounts, he's done a wonderful job. And yet it's this sense of, well, if we're not harsh to them, if we don't ask them the tough questions, maybe next time they won't ask our nominees the tough questions. I don't think we're going to see that. I think we have to win with overwhelming numbers in the Senate and hold that majority in the House, and that's how we start to change America.
We absolutely won't see that. And, they talk about the lack of compromise in the Congress now. Well, maybe you had some compromise, like you said, back in the day when maybe the budget was not out of sync. Fiscally, we're in pretty good shape. We cannot compromise because our country is on the verge of collapse. I mean, that's just the way it is. And if we compromise on a fiscal policy, we're as good as saying, goodbye USA. Well, that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. And of course, you just threw that softball to the state treasurer who lives in the world of finance. As I watched the super committee process, keep in mind they were arguing over cutting $1.2 trillion out of a 10-year budget. $1.2 trillion is a huge number, except when you look at it in the context of our federal budget. That 1.2% represented less than 3% of the planned spending over the next 10 years, and they couldn't find a way to agree to cut 3%. Not only could most Hoosier families cut 3% from their household budgets in a year, by the way, not just over 10 years, they've already done it in this Great Recession. In the midst of all that, I laid out my own budget plan, and I spent the better part of a week going around the state to newspapers, TV stations, radio, and laid out my budget plan, and it called for a $7.6 trillion rollback. It would actually reduce federal spending from the plan limit 18% from where it is now, and at the end of that 10 years, we'd have 6% lower number than we have today. As I would lay that number out to reporters, I always got this question. They would have this look of bewilderment that I was calling for a $7.6 trillion reduction. And then they'd say, but Richard, if they can't agree on $1.2 trillion, how would they ever agree on 7.6? And my answer is, they won't. It's why we have to change the face of the United States Congress to get this sense of fiscal responsibility in place. We are playing with a lit fuse, and the fuse isn't that long, on a fiscal time bomb. I carry in my pocket, and I will hold up in front of you. Well, maybe I will. I thought I brought it with me. I have a wonderful little note from the Federal Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe that I always carry with me that is in the face amount of $100 trillion. People look at it like that can't be real, but it is real. It was issued in 2008. This is what happens when you, A, try to spend your way to prosperity, and B, destroy your credit rating where no other government will loan you money. You just have to start printing money. We are getting dangerously close to that type of environment. This is a historic time. We were speaking before about history and Abraham Lincoln. We always think that history was something of yesterday. It was written in the books of yesterday or a year or 10 or 100 years ago. Let's put this in context. In July, we had the downgrade of the United States credit, a historical event. It's never happened before. We had just this year, for the first time in more than 100 years, the United States was not the world's leading economy for manufacturing, a historical event. We have, for the first time in peacetime in American history, a national debt that is greater than our gross domestic product, over $15 trillion. We have a $15 trillion, a historic number. These are historic times, and we are going to be judged by future generations as to how we steer the country through this. If we just put our head in the sand, like, say, the Greeks or the Italians, there's a predictable outcome. And I don't think anybody who's listening to this wants to see that outcome. We have to take control of the situation and start rolling back government.
One of the things we had Major General Paul Valley on our show a couple months ago, and he pretty much echoed the same things you're saying. But his fear was that we don't have enough warriors in the Senate and Congress on our side to bring about this change, and that's what he fears. Do you see any warriors? When we talk about Dick Lugar, Dick Lugar was a great senator, but he is not going to fight for what we believe in any longer.
Well, I would simply add to that, when was the last time you've seen Dick Lugar on Face the Nation or some of these programs talking about things that are relevant to average working Hoosiers? I mean, I understand he's a great international leader. His expertise is in foreign affairs. That's great. I don't fault him for that. But you're right. The battle today isn't about what's happening with our foreign relations or foreign policies. It's about what's happening to the American dollar. And there are warriors there. The same senator that I mentioned a few moments ago, as part of our discussion, he asked, what senators do I really find that I admire there? And I can give you a list. Jim DeMint, Ron Johnson from up in Wisconsin, Mike Lee from Utah has been absolutely amazing. He's only in his 12th month now. Rand Paul from across the river, Pat Toomey, David Vitter. I mean, these are people, Marco Rubio, these are people who are ready to change the country for the long term. Almost all of them are in their 40s. They have the potential of being there a long, long time. And I think setting a historical course to put this country back in a comeback mode to start to get things headed the right direction. As was said to me, they need just a few more conservative voices to join them, and they are going to be the majority of the Republican caucus in the United States Senate. And that is exciting news.
It's funny, Richard, when you mentioned, if I had to name one senator that reminded me the most of you, it would be Jim DeMint.
Well, I take that as a compliment.
And I'm kind of
Thank you.
surprised he's not. Kind of surprised maybe why he didn't run for president or why his name isn't tossed around as a vice president. But talk about a guy with morals, conviction, a moral compass. That's the guy.
That might be why his name isn't being mentioned. In all seriousness, he is not that compromising kind of person that so many of them are. One thing I always hear every day, someone will say to me as they think about the opportunity of voting for Dick Lugar or voting for Richard Mourdock, they say, well, there's that seniority. I hate to give up that seniority. To that argument, I have 2 points. Number one, how's it working for us lately? I don't think the seniority system is producing that much. It's really what we need. And secondly, the balanced budget amendment that went through the Congress this time has 2 provisions to it that are unique. It had never been on a balanced budget amendment before. One was to include a permanent cap on spending at 18% of the GDP. And the other was to provide a mechanism so that if times change, the Congress could, by supermajority, raise that limit or change the limit from 18% to some other number. Those 2 things are important because if we just had a balanced budget amendment, like the one that was passed a couple of weeks ago in the House, by the way, if it's simply a balanced budget amendment that doesn't have limitations, all that means is they can raise taxes however they need to keep up with the spending. That's not the right answer. My point of telling that story, those 2 provisions, having the supermajority and that permanent cap on spending, were put on the balanced budget amendment by Senator Mike Lee from Utah less than 60 days after he was sworn in. It wasn't seniority that brought that idea to the forefront. It was the fact it was somebody new, somebody who was thinking outside the box, somebody who had been out there in the working world and understood the danger that people seemingly inside the Washington Beltway didn't get.
We're talking to Richard Mourdock, candidate for United States Senate, here on Rick and Rick at Night, the voice of liberty here in the Ohio River Valley.
How about that phone number, Rick?
The phone number, we got local numbers 812-574-0953 and toll free 877-953-0953. And the Bulldog has to keep me up on that, keep the phone number going.
I got to make sure you say the numbers right, too, and you did. Congratulations.
Richard, one of the things, a guy that I didn't admire, but I admired, but I watched him on C-SPAN 2 a lot, was Robert Carlisle, and his nickname Sheets, but Bird, but he knew the Senate rules better than anybody else. And I keep telling people, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but politics is knowing the rules better than anybody else. I know the parliamentary procedure. I got it from Clarence Thomas, as far as I've got it in my back pocket because I don't have breast pockets when I'm treating patients, but I'm sitting there going, I read the Constitution. The Senate rule book is awfully complicated. One of the things, when you get in the United States Senate, that's one of the things I'd urge you to become the keeper of the book. But also, one of the things that has troubled me forever is the fact now the threshold to get anything done in the Senate is 60 votes. And it's not any place other than it's accepted. We're not going to do the filibuster. I'm a roundabout way of asking you the nuclear option. which was run away from by Lindsey Grahamnesty and Mike DeWine and a couple other the rhinos in the Senate. What do you know of the nuclear option, as well as are you in favor of it?
Well, certainly we have seen what's been happening lately where the cloture rule is being used to hinder a lot of bills that might otherwise be making it through. And as you said, it's not in the Constitution. I think we need a greater movement towards transparency in the Congress as well as all aspects of the federal government. And the fact that it's not out there, of course, others will say, well, there's nothing about political parties in there. There's nothing about the rules for the Senate or the House at all in there. And that's true. But what was clearly set up was that both of those bodies, the House and the Senate, were meant to be majority rule type of bodies. And we've somewhat gotten beyond that a little bit with a supermajority in the sense of what the cloture rule is. And without some specific demarcation, if you will, in the Constitution itself, I think that's something that ought to be moved away from the system. I think it is getting to be more of a burden than it ought to be.
It's part of the impasse this last a couple months ago was for the budget, and they passed a budget that promoted even more spending. One of the hopes that I'd heard from Mike Pence saying, instead of the baseline budgeting that we currently go under, he was thinking they could go to a zero-based budget.
Yeah,
I haven't heard any more about it.
Yeah, well, that is absolutely true. I mean,
and can you explain what a baseline budget is versus zero?
Let me start with today's model, which is we start with whatever the budget is this year, and then we add some percentage to it next year. It virtually always goes up.
And Richard, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.5%. Is a round number that they use?
It varies. I think that's a little high for government as a whole, but certainly there are some agencies like the EPA that's been going up as much as 15%, certainly way ahead of the rates of inflation, which is why the fastest growing industry is government in America right now. What Mike Pence was suggesting, and others, and something I would certainly like to see, is every year, every agency of government has to basically start from scratch and say, okay, this is where we are. This is what we need to do, and start through that process from zero. What does it really take to get done what our vital mission is? George Herbert Walker Bush used to use the term mission creep. And I think that those two words beautifully describe what so much of government is when we have duplication from one agency to another, to another, to another. In fact, one of the things I mentioned in the budget program I put out, one of the things I called for was the elimination of the Department of Energy. And right away, Senator Lugar's team was all over me. Oh, Mourdock doesn't know what he's doing because, a big part of the role of the Department of Energy is to look after America's nuclear stockpile. Well, if they read the news release closely, I said that those functions that are there that deal with nuclear arms ought to go back to the Defense Department from which they originally came. Most people, when you tell them that it's not the Department of Defense that's looking after America's nuclear arsenal, they're stunned. Well, no, it's in a different silo. It's another bureaucracy that was set up. And there's agency after agency. A friend of mine owned a business here in Indiana, great business, and they make erosion control mats. Picture those construction projects you see along a highway. There'll be a little slope along it, and they roll out those straw fiber blankets to keep erosion from occurring. He brought that product into the United States back in the 1980s and decided the best way to sell it was to make sure it would get specified on federal government contracts. But to be specified, it had to meet certain standards approved by certain government agencies. So here's the multiple choice question for you. Do you suppose they had to get those tests verified by the U.S. Department of Interior, the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Agriculture, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or the Bureau of Land Management? And the answer, of course, is all of the above. Every one of them. They had to go all over the country to get all of those agencies to sign off on erosion control blankets. And that's just a small snippet of what we see in government time and time again. There are so many agencies doing the work with 3 or 4, and if you went back to a starting point of zero, justify your budget from scratch, I think you could start to remove those types of duplicities that are out there.
One of the ideas I heard advanced as far as even the state agencies is that all state agencies other than those designated by the Constitution be sunsetted. and then that way they justify their existence. Could that be used in federal government?
Absolutely. I think it could and should be. Any law that's being passed out there, I think, should have some tenure to it, because we still have government agencies out there that are paying pensions for Civil War widows, that type of thing, and Spanish-American War. I mean, these things just never go away. And even more to the point, aside from those types of entitlement programs, if you will, just basic laws that may have applied, for instance, when telephones were first beginning, no longer have any application whatsoever in a time of wireless technologies. And those types of things should be looked at every now and then. It doesn't mean they necessarily have to automatically be repealed, but somebody ought to certainly say, yeah, this is still applicable for the day and time in which we live.
Richard, the thing that bothers me about all these agencies, especially the EPA too, and I don't know if it's unconstitutional, it sure seems like it is to me, but they operate as an entity to themselves. They don't answer to Congress. They make their own rules. I don't think that's the way it was supposed to be when our founders set up our country, that an agency could be set up and just start making rules. I think in our ad for your appearance here, we talked about 2 weeks from now they were going to ban the incandescent light bulb.
Exactly.
I think maybe that is not going to happen, but they were going to ban the 100-watt bulb this year, I think the 60-watt bulb next year, and then the 40-watt bulb in 2013.
The sad part of that, though, even if they haven't successfully banned the usage, they basically chase those industries right out of America because they're already gone. And it was the very threat they were going to do it. We talk about why do American businesses pack up and leave to go somewhere else? It's because the laws keep changing and basically force people to go to some other country, and that's a classic example.
And I'm sure some people out there, we're talking about when we talk about closing down some of these agencies, some of our listeners may think, man, that's too radical. But when we talk about the situation our country's in, these are the kind of things that are going to happen. Beyond that, we've got a caller. We've got Christina, and I believe Christina's from Madison, and she's got a question for Richard.
Hi, Richard. This is Christine. I've got a couple questions for you, and then I'll go ahead and hang up and let you answer. First of all, I want to say that you sound very fiscally responsible, and I'm sure that being our Indiana State Treasurer, that's something that you need to be. But 2 questions. First of all, I'm very concerned about our energy here in Indiana being taken away from us as far as how we harvest our energy. I'm very scared, even though I consider myself to be an environmental person. I recycle and I try to do everything I can to help the environment, but I'm very scared about our energy and how some of those different fossil fuels will be taken away from us. And I wanted to find out, what kind of experience do you have if you were to go and represent Indiana and vote on different types of laws or policy that affect our country? And then secondly, I'm wondering, how would someone volunteer for your campaign?
Well, the second one's very easy.
Thanks, Christina.
Yes, thank you, Christine. The second part's a very quick response, which is go to richardmourdock.com, and Mourdock is spelled M-O-U-R-D-O-C-K, so richardmourdock.com, and not only can people volunteer there, if they like, they can even contribute, and we encourage listeners to do that. And to the first part about the energy business, as unlikely as it may sound, I'm actually a geologist by training, spent 31 years in the energy business, so it is something I know more than, dare I say, a little bit about. Clearly we have the most deliberate attempt in American history right now through the Obama administration to try to restructure the American economy based on the so-called green energy. And it is something that I absolutely abhor. I understand, and I hope most who look at this issue at all understand, the reason we have the energy policies we have is because so many in this administration and in Congress as a whole think that mankind is changing the global climate. As a geologist, I'll tell you, I don't see that happening at all. The Earth's temperature right now may be warming a little bit, but that's nothing new. I ask all audiences when this subject comes up to imagine, just picture in your mind the outline of the state of Indiana. I live way down in the southwest corner, little town of Darmstadt, just north of Evansville. And over in the southwest corner of Indiana, just a few miles west of my home, there's a little sign that marks a hillside that to the naked eye of most people looks like a little hill. To those of us who are geologists, we recognize that as something called the terminal moraine. It was the southernmost extent of the glacial ice shield that covered North America a little less than 100,000 years ago. So you had the entire state of Indiana, virtually, all the way to the modern-day Ohio River, under a glacial ice shield. Has the climate changed? Yeah, I think it has. But it wasn't changed because of sport utility vehicles, coal-fired generating plants, or for that matter, flatulating herds of dairy cattle, as some would have us believe. It's a natural process of the Earth and the solar system, and yet we're changing our energy policy to solve a problem that is not man-induced. It is causing our costs to go up. It is causing us to be less competitive, and it is causing more and more American businesses to pack up and leave. It is just error upon folly, and it's something we have to change. And to your direct question, how would I like to handle that in the United States Senate? By being a bearer of truth, of the science, not just of the hyperbole that some would like to pitch as science.
You know, and so many of the people in our country, you know, the people that believe in global warming, that believe we need to have all these restrictions, they don't seem to care what China does. They don't seem to care what the Middle East does, getting oil. We're the most advanced country in the world. We can take stuff out of the ground, produce it cleaner and more efficient than anybody in the world. But it's not okay for us to do it. It's okay for everybody else in the world. And it's almost like, I hate to say it, but there's people in our country that want to see this country brought down to size.
Many of them, I think, see it as a massive means of redistribution of wealth. And clearly the Kyoto protocols that were brought up, and even this last week in discussions about through the UN, there were more discussions about penalties that would be imposed on the wealthier nations to cause their cash to flow in because of this injustice that was performed on the environment based by wealth. It's nonsense. It really is. I mean, we have to look out for the United States of America. If we let the markets work, we're going to find out we can produce energy very inexpensively, very safely, very cleanly, and as we're going to develop new technologies, and we'll continue to be the cleanest producing industries. You're right, Rick. I mean, in China, where there's a new coal-fired generating plant coming out about every 2 weeks online, their air quality standards are not even close to ours, and nobody's really raising an issue for them.
And we are one world. It's
well,
not like what they do over there doesn't have an effect on the planet, even though, like you said, I totally don't agree that we're creating global warming as a mankind.
Yeah, that's right. It is one world. But, you know, even to the point of the Keystone Pipeline, you know, why did President Obama back off of that? Because it wasn't about some potential threat to an aquifer in Nebraska. What the threat was the wild-eyed eco-environmental extremists are saying we got to get away from carbon fuels. And obviously bringing oil from the oil shales of Alberta, Canada, down to the Gulf Coast, those are going to produce more carbon dioxide, more of the dreaded, in their terms, greenhouse gases. And just to see, you know, that Keystone Pipeline to me is endemic of so many problems. Why does it take, literally, an act of Congress to do a construction project? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. It's going to take an act of Congress. And in this most recent vote now on the payroll tax, they've included that, forcing Obama's hand in 60 days. And undoubtedly in 60 days, if everything passed the way it's put through, he's going to come back just as he did before in 60 days and say, well, we still don't have time, haven't had time to study it. We're going to put it on the shelf.
And you wonder how many industrious entrepreneurs out there, talented people, throw their hands up and are just giving up.
It's
and
happening.
when they give up, they don't start a business. They don't hire people. They don't create new technologies. Because like you were talking about earlier, about all the agencies your friend had to go through, it's almost not worth it for people.
That's right. We have the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And that in itself should be telling us something. Canada, by the way, is ratcheting its taxes down, corporate taxes, to 15%. Canada sees itself as a natural resource-based economy, which is always the strongest economy. It used to be the loonie, the Canadian dollar, wasn't worth nearly as much as the American dollar, and now that's beginning to reverse because it's a natural resource-based dollar, commodity-based dollar. In other words, they're not printing money. They're driving up the value of their dollar based on their production of goods and services. We have some real concerns in every area of the economy, but there are three critically sick industries in our economy we have to change. One is the energy business that we've just been discussing. The other is the business of finance, especially for community bankers and smaller banks, not just the big majors that Dodd-Frank really played to. And last but not least, the healthcare industry. Those three components of our economy bear such a huge total cost, such a huge part of our economy. If we don't get those three things fixed, we're going to have a sick economy for a long time to come.
Well, unfortunately, right now, we have a group of people in Obama's inner circle that believe that the economy should be a command and control economy from Washington. And I think that's kind of like what some of the communist countries believed in. This week, Nancy Pelosi said that we need to extend unemployment. It'll create 600,000 jobs. Harry Reid said that he had never met a millionaire that ever created a job.
I heard that statement. That's incredible.
So these are the things that, as conservatives, we throw our hands up in disbelief, and I think liberals probably have to also. Maybe they won't admit it, but these kind of things are so crazy. And if we don't change this mindset, we are in big trouble.
We really are, but I'm going to put on my happy face here for a moment, because as I've traveled this state since February when I announced my candidacy for the U.S. Senate, there are so many people who are coming up to me and saying, you know, it's time, and not just in a reference to Mr. Lugar, but with that sense that they recognize we need to change direction. There is still that sense of almost Ronald Reagan-like optimism in this country. You know, in his first inaugural address, he made that famous statement that government isn't the solution to our problems, government is the problem. Well, here we are 31 years later, and that still remains the case. But his next phrase in that same speech was that the economic difficulties that we face didn't come about in a month or a week or a year, and we won't get out of them in a month or a week or a year. It's going to take some time. But I do believe the American people, because I see it in Hoosiers, are ready to say it's time to roll back government. And I think that's what 2012 is going to be all about.
And it does not matter if you're Democrat or Republican. Maybe people like former Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Reid, maybe they're doing us a favor. Maybe they're doing our country a favor by making statements like this, and maybe it's waking people up saying, you know what, we've got some loony people running this country right now.
Well, we talked about Rush Limbaugh earlier. You know, he likes to use that phrase that we never want to see the last of the liberals disappear. We need to keep them in a museum just to remind us how bad they can be at times. And maybe that's what Chuck Schumer's and Pelosi's and Harry Reid's are going to do. But when Harry Reid made that statement about never having heard or seen a millionaire who created a job, it's like, okay, and how many of the Occupy Wall Street people have created a job other than for the maintenance and janitorial people who have to come in and clean up behind them? I mean, there is a basic American work ethic that remains true. Right now, it is being tested, to be sure, as our entitlement mentality has been expanded and expanded and expanded. But I think, again, enough people are, even though that we appear to be at that tipping point where 48% of Americans are now receiving some form of cash benefit from government, 47% of all American households paid no income tax last year, that would make you think we're at the tipping point and maybe we've lost control. But I still hear of enough Americans who want to see something better for their children and better for their grandchildren. They see what's happening in Greece, and they know we're on that path. And they want
Richard,
to turn the corner.
In your Red State speech, you said that this is a time when history may be being made that we don't realize it. And maybe 50 years from now, we'll look back at this time as, I don't know if you're going to call it the Second Great Awakening or whatever, but a time when we got our country back.
I think it's going to be exactly that. And, you know, you're pretty good if you remember my Red State speeches. I don't remember what I said at Red State, but I'm flattered that you do. I have said in some speeches lately, though, and I always love a good quote, but one of my favorites, of course, is Winston Churchill, who spoke of the RAF after the air battle of Britain and said, never have so many owed so much to so few, speaking of those few Royal Air Force people. I think, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, that 50, 80, 100 years from now, when we again have a thriving American prosperity, when we are leading the world in all areas of technology, I think there might be those people who look back at the Tea Party and say, never have so many owed so much to so few, because the Tea Party is turning the corner. I truly believe that.
This is Rick and Rick at Night. We're talking to almost United States Senator Richard Mourdock. We're the voice of liberty. Pardon my frog, but it's got the old Ohio River Valley guns. We've just scratched the surface, because as far as going down the path of Obamacare, Rick and I did town hall meetings when Barron Hill wouldn't, but that's just that's if we repeal that, we've got to fix it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that this goes back to Phil Graham back in '93. He had an MSA, medical savings account thing, basically putting Medicare patients on MSAs, Medicaid, and allowing private individuals get into that. And that's just one way of solving it. What do you think of that path?
Well, the health savings accounts are a great option. You know, when Governor Daniels came in 2005, and my numbers may be off on this a little bit, but state employees, there were something like 5 or 6% of them had healthcare savings accounts. And the governor promoted them, worked through the insurance policy, made them more attractive, and now it's something like 80% of all state employees have healthcare savings accounts. They like to see that money that they're not using building up in an account with their name on it, so that at some future point, if they need it, they have it for an emergency, or if they need it in retirement to buy longer-term insurance. So certainly it's a way that people have skin in the game. As you know, the biggest problem we have in healthcare right now is the third-party payer, that when somebody else is paying the bills, nobody who's getting the service is really looking at the cost. And that just leads to explosive cost. There's only two areas, I've noted this for many years, there's only two areas where technology in America leads to higher cost. Almost every place, technology results in lower cost. When the first desktop computers and the first cell phones came out, incredibly expensive. Now they're relatively cheap. The two areas where new technology never matters, Department of Defense and healthcare. You get more technology and costs just keep going up because, again, it's the government paying the bills and nobody's keeping it under control.
Now we're seeing that in education.
Absolutely
Government's
true.
taking over student loans. They're making it easy for people to get loans. Colleges keep raising their costs because they know they're going to get their money. It's just incredible.
It really is, this expansion of government. And again, this is where I have a fundamental difference with Mr. Lugar. Again, he's a fine gentleman, had a long career, absolutely someone I respect. But when you look at his record, at least compare it to what my record and intentions are, he's a big government guy and I'm not. And that is the difference. I saw recently he put out like a 50-page white paper on the Dick Lugar energy plan. And it said something, if we can put all this in effect, we'll save $1.8 billion over 10 years. Well, I can save $1.8 billion just next year, and that's by reducing the Department of Energy's budget just 6%. You know, that's just 1 year. And in fact, in my broader plan that I referred to a few moments ago of $7.6 billion in rollbacks, I totally did away with the Department of Energy. But it's that kind of aggressive, go in, find the dollars budgeting that we need. You know, one of the things I'm most proud of is having served in this state's administration in the last several years when Indiana, without question, and I hope everyone listening to this who is a Hoosier is proud of this, without question, Indiana is in the most fiscally sound state of the 50 states, at least we're in the top 3, without question. It's indisputable. While most states, and certainly the country, has seen its credit rating go down, Indiana's credit rating has gone up. While most states have been adding debt, certainly the federal government has been exploding, we've reduced the level of debt. We've been paying down the mortgage in this state. That's taken fiscal discipline. It's taken a lot of control, but it's showing the benefits. And as a result, we're now one of the more business-friendly states.
And you and the governor need to be applauded for that, I might add.
Well, and so do the state legislators, frankly, because their role has been very, very forthright. They've made some tough decisions, haven't always been popular, but they've done the right thing.
One of the things Rick was quoting Pelosi and Reed, and I just finished reading Peter Schweitzer's book on Throw Them All Out. And I recommend it to the people's reading down here in Jefferson County because we have the book now. I know because we got the library to get it. But basically, the rules that govern the rest of us don't apply to people in Congress. They can get deals. They can get deals on legislation they're considering. They can get, they get insider trading information. Martha Stewart went to prison. Pelosi didn't. I mean, this is just amazing. The anger that just from reading these pages. It's just
and Richard's talking about, when we talk about Senator Lugar, and I think he doesn't see that. And when you talk about he's fallen out of touch, he doesn't see the way our normal everyday Hoosier is feeling about what's going on.
And I think, again, it is, and maybe this is a virtue of his character. I don't think he believes that because people are senators and congressmen, they wouldn't do things like that because, my goodness, they're senators and congressmen, because back in the day, senators and congressmen would never act like that. But, just today, Darrell Issa put out a report that said there's at least 4 members of the United States Congress who are getting loans from Freddie and Fannie at a VIP rate. Now, he hasn't released the names yet, but that just comes to your point, Rick. I mean, they're making special deals for themselves. And, I understand, as someone who worked in the business world for 31 years, how easy it is to have information come across your desk that sets your mind thinking as to where the future is going and what will be a good investment and what won't be. But when you're sitting at one of those desks and you know you have the power to make or stop legislation that's going to affect, maybe infect is the right word, affect some investment down the road, well, after a while, you might start to think, I'm not dealing with anything special. I'm just that much smarter than everybody else. Well, you're not really smarter. You're just better informed because of the nature of your position. And I think, frankly, all congressmen ought to be required to put what they have in a trust, much as most presidents do. In fact, maybe all presidents are required.
Well, they're saying even blind trust,
Exactly.
if you have an administrator that's a buddy of yours, you can, I mean, they're not anything.
And I think that was John Boehner's response. I think that's what he said he was doing with his money. Hope he was telling the truth. But
again, in Schweitzer's book, he's sitting there saying they got it in blind trust, but if they got a buddy that's administrating,
right,
you know.
right.
Well, if what you're suggesting is happening, then the administrator is not meeting the fiduciary responsibility of serving as an administrator of a blind trust, and that's another problem.
Right.
That's a legal issue already if that's happening.
We've only got a couple of minutes. Richard, we want you to come back. I hope you will. I do have a question. A fair tax fan? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh,
Are you a fair tax fan?
You know, I believe in my elevator speech, the three things I want to do more than anything else in the U.S. Senate. Number one is reduce the immoral level of debt. Number two is change the tax code from taxing the creation of wealth to taxing consumption, because 47% of all households now aren't paying income tax. Everybody ought to have skin in the game. Consumption tax would do that. And number three is we have to get the jackboot of federal regulations off the neck of small businesses. I haven't taken a fair tax pledge because when you do that, most people tend to think on December 31st or someday in some year in the future we have the present tax code, and January 1st the next day we'll have a new one. It's never going to be that way. This, again, is why I like what Mike Lee presented with that 18% cap in a balanced budget amendment, because if we get that implemented first, then you can work fully from the tax code we have to some type of a consumption tax, and certainly a fair tax is one that ought to be considered at that point.
We're running low on time. I just want to say that, Richard, if we can in 2012 get a warrior such as yourself and several others, we can get this done.
We can indeed.
And I know you're a warrior. I think maybe we even told General Valley that we have a warrior on his way.
Well, I'm flattered to have that adjective applied to my name. I just am very much a person who loves this country and who fears for its future. It's a beautiful thing to be 60 years old, to run for an office that, quite frankly, I don't have to have. But I'm doing this because I want to make the hard decisions that most people who want to kick the can down the road, I want to make the decisions and set the course
and
right.
I've had many people ask me, and Rick has too, why do you guys do that Tea Party stuff? What are you guys doing? I don't know why. I just feel compelled to do it. I feel a compulsion to do something about what's going on. I know you do, and I know Rick does.
Well, I hope you keep doing it, if for no other reason. This is no small thing, what I'm about to say. Keep doing it because you give those of us who put our names on the ballots that much energy, that much faith, that we're not out there acting alone. You know, I know some politicians who do things, and I think they do it just for their own sense of accomplishment, and that ought not be the purpose.
Absolutely.
I watched a movie yesterday. It was a Christmas movie. It's 1944, Since You Went Away. And at the very end of the movie, it said, "Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart, all ye that hope in the Lord." Oh, by the way, that's Psalm 31:24. Merry Christmas, Madison, from the Tea Party. We're going to be back. We're not sure when, but we'll be back next year. And we're going to have Rick Barry and Lisa Singh and Rick Roos, and we're going to have our friends Richard Mourdock and Mike Pence and a lot of Patriots and Warriors back, and we're going to win this fight.
Randy Fry,
Jim Smith. We've got it. Mike Sondrel. Good night, Madison and America. God bless and keep you, our listeners, and this the most wonderful country that God's graced. A very Merry Christmas and a blessed New Year. And for the rest, our local members, we're going to go over to the Boneyard Grill. And one of my favorite quotes of me is, "Call me a poor one, Christian." Good night, Madison.
and Richard will be there.
Indeed.
Please come and meet a great
Yes.
man. Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily the views of Wagon Wheel Broadcasting, WIKI Radio, its management, employees, or advertisers. This program paid for by the Jefferson County Sons and Daughters of Liberty.
We've got the Ohio River Valley covered with your country favorites, local news, and local sports on 95.3 WIKI Carrollton, Madison.